Joining us now is a draftsman, designer, art director, show producer, and author who, as part of the second generation of Disney Imagineers, developed many of our favorite attractions, both domestically and around the world, including Journey into Imagination, World of Motion, Disneyland's animated neon Mickey Star Trader sign, Disneyland Paris's Fantasyland, and Le Château de la Belle à Bois d'Ormont. I have to try my French there. We'll see how I can do. Disney Quest, Rock and Roller Coaster, Hong Kong Disneyland, and Radiator Springs Racers, just to name a few. A lifelong fan who traveled from California to Florida by himself at the age of 12 to visit Walt Disney World's opening day, he's enjoyed an incredible 30-year career with Imagineering, working with many of the original and modern greats, including Jack Sayers, Claude Coates, Mark Davis, Skip Lang, David Todd, Eddie Soto, David Mumford, Jeff Burke, Chris Teets, Tim Delaney, and, of course, Tony Baxter. He's also the author of an upcoming book about less well-known Imagineers who made important contributions to the art and craft of Disney parks. Please give a warm Walt Disney World welcome to the man who once delivered Thurl Ravenscroft's newspaper, Tom Morris.
Oh, you got one. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, well, I almost don't feel worthy being up here compared to the other greats and legends. I was just a little punk, really, who liked Disney a lot, who started to gain a fondness and an affinity for it as I got towards adolescence. Actually, I was first interested in animation. That's kind of what hooked me into it initially. I think like The Jungle Book and some of the films in the 60s, Mary Poppins, of course. And so I was very interested in animation, and there was this wonderful book that had come out called The Art of Animation. It was $10. It was too expensive. My dad said I had to wait until my birthday, and then it was sold out, and I wouldn't get that book for 2 or 3 more years. But it was only $3 at Robinson's by that time, so I could get 3 of them. I've always been, I was enamored by the artwork in there, but also kind of relating to this presentation and something that Marty Sklar learned from Walt Disney was, as much as you can, show but don't tell. So as much as I can, I try to show without, going on too long with my, sometimes overdone narration. But the other book that was, I would say was, it made an impression was, these how to draw books that they sold at the parks. And I always remembered this little trick about Jiminy Cricket or anything that you're doing is test it out in silhouette form first. And so that little lesson came in handy later when I designed the castle for Paris. But this presentation is going to be focused on Walt Disney World and my very small contributions to Walt Disney World. And of course, like many of us, this was another
and now your host, Walt Disney.
Influencing factor on my growing up.
All these little streets are going to be very intriguing, little shops and things, and live plants and things, all kinds of body movements and things, sacking towns and things.
So I liked all those things. I liked this thing that opened in 1967. I didn't even know it was underway. I knew that the haunted house, we called it, haunted mansion, was sitting there forever. But I didn't know about this until one day my dad came home. He was a high school teacher, an art and English teacher, and he came home one day and said, "Guess what? I got a summer job at Disneyland." "Oh, that's neat. I like Disneyland." What are you going to be doing there? He said, "I'm working on this new thing they just opened called Pirates of the Caribbean." And he took me on that and told me a little bit about, we're going underground now we're going under the restaurant, now we're going behind the train track. And I'm like, it really intrigued me. And so just from a architectural and spatial management standpoint, suddenly my interest went from animation to architecture and placemaking. So I was a geek at a young age. There were two other kids in high school that were all, oh no, not high school, this is like junior high school, that were interested in Disney. So it was like, there's 3 people in the world that are interested to this level in Disney. And that meant going there 3 times a year. Instead of the normal, families went there once a year. And my family and I, the whole family would go once or twice, and then I would go with some friends once or twice. And when I threatened to go a 5th time one time, my mom said, if you go one more time this year, I'm taking you to a shrink. And she should have. And that's me, unknown guest in the middle there, building bear country on the upper left there. But so I did this crazy thing when I was 12 years old, and I went to Disney World on October 1st, 1971, on Delta Airlines. My first flight, my first time out of California, and I did this by saving up my money for my paper route, and on my paper route, Thurl Ravenscroft, but also Jack Sayers. He was on my paper route. And I told him that I was flying to Disney World. He goes, well, that's a coincidence. I am too. So he set me up, when I got out there with a VIP hostess. And there she is. She's kind of behind me there and also off to the right. And I have her name somewhere. I don't have it on the top of my mind or on the top of my head right now. But they sent me some bumper stickers afterwards, which I only have one left. These are some of the photos I took that day. This is October 1. There was nobody there, hardly. That's what it looked like. I've tried to color correct some of these photos. Red, slurry asphalt in Frontierland. I'm sure you remember that, Tom. And that was replaced not long afterwards, because what worked in California didn't always work in Florida. On the upper left, they're still building Tomorrowland. It was not open on opening day, nor was 20,000 Leagues. And I think Peter Pan, if I'm not mistaken, was not quite operating that day. Teacups on the lower right there without a roof on it. So these are some of the interesting shots. The one in the middle of the Haunted Mansion is interesting from a Haunted Mansion standpoint. Those are the original Mark Davis, not the redos that were done later. But those are based on the original Mark Davis paintings. And again, me heading into adolescence. This little 15-minute or 15-second slide sums up my adolescence.
Take it easy, you'll blow a fuse.
So when you get into high school, you got to start figuring out what it is you're going to do. And it was kind of a scary time in some ways in the 70s. It was a weird time because the Vietnam War, and there was just a strangeness. There was anti-authoritarianism and
James W. Rouse, developer of the new town of Columbia, said in part, I hold a view that may be somewhat shocking to an audience as sophisticated as this, that the greatest piece of urban design in the United States today is Disneyland. I find more to learn in the standards that have been set and in the goals that have been achieved in the development of Disneyland than in any other single piece of physical development in the country.
Peter Blake, the architectural editor of New York Magazine, recommends that all of New York City's town planning work be turned over to the Walt Disney Mickey Mouse organization because they seem to be the only people in America who are able to get anything done. Now, don't laugh. When you look around at this new town they have built here in Central Florida, you will think he is right. It is the most imaginative and most effective piece of urban planning in America. We all remember seeing years ago those slick, futuristic drawings saying what the future of the American city was going to be. Gleaming buildings, fast monorails. Well, this is the future, and none of it has happened. Nobody has done it but Disney.
selected that specifically for this because it was very aspirational. This, in the 70s, Disney really showed off and talked a lot about their urban planning and environmental consciousness, and that appealed to me. And in the mid-70s, thinking about what you're going to do for a career, in high school, you're kind of guided into, you could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could go into the defense industry, work for Martin Marietta or Northrop, and none of that sounded very interesting or exciting to me. I kind of thought back about animation, and they told me, my high school counselor said, well, animation is kind of a dying art, dying industry. I said, well, what about film? And they said, well, that's all Hollywood, and you have to know somebody. I go, well, I was thinking about going to Cal Arts, and they said, well, that would be good if you want to major in smoking pot. So it was kind of like discouraging. I didn't know what to do. By this time, I was actually working at Disneyland. Whoa! Yeah. I was working at Disneyland, and I was aware of Imagineering, and it looked like a cool thing, but I didn't know. I knew that it was like 200 people, not very big. Well, long story short, I was able to sneak into the Disney studio, not really sneak because they would just let you walk in with your Disneyland ID. So I spent a couple afternoons with animators who took me around and showed me how they did things, and kind of behind the scenes private tour. And then Tony Baxter did the same thing for me for WED, and WED looked a lot more interesting, and there were just so many. It was like a big toy store. And there's so many different facets to it. So I thought, well, maybe I'll get into Imagineering. And one thing was for sure, I wanted to do something like this and not, be an engineer for a defense company. And then Disney started up the Epcot project, and they were very aggressive about pushing this in-house, internally. They had a very promote from within philosophy. And some of the things that the executives were saying, in town halls and also in some of the literature, like, Don Tatum is saying, we believe that our core capabilities as communicators and storytellers and innovators grants us a unique role to play in making the world a better place. And Card Walker is saying, the insight which led Walt to propose Epcot is as valid today as it ever was, and needed now even more than ever. And if that sounds idealistic, let me say first that we are idealists. And so I thought, well, these kind of square executives are actually kind of cool.
Just going to play Jonathan.
Oh, okay. Now it makes it look like I peed. I got so excited at this Epcot idea. So I thought this was kind of interesting. Like, well, this sounds like an interesting company to continue working for because it seems kind of idealistic.
During the last half hour, Spaceship Earth has acquired 4,000 more passengers. We live in a world today faced with staggering problems and a tremendous need for better communication and more understanding of the complexities of our Spaceship Earth.
So they started an aggressive program, an internal program, to begin staffing up for Epcot and Tokyo Disneyland and also for feature animation. And they began a program, at least at Disneyland, and I'm sure they did here too in Florida, where it was a career advancement program where you would, if you're going to college, you would submit your portfolio and resume, and it would go into some magic database. And if that role came up, they need you, for Epcot. And so I submitted my portfolio and my resume. I was in my first or second year. No, when I submitted it, I was in my first year of college, thinking that in 3 or 4 years, something would come up. But something came up within the first year. They needed draftsmen really badly. And what was in my portfolio was everything I had done in high school, and then 1 year of college, some illustrations I had done in college, but it was mostly drafting from high school, 3 years of drafting. And they said, do you want to go work up at WED? They had actually 2 headhunters.
This is WED Enterprises, a unique design organization established in the early 1950s to plan Disneyland and later Walt Disney World. Today's WED staff includes artists, designers, architects, computer technicians, engineers, and dozens of others working in a harmonic blend of space-age creativity called Imagineering. And Epcot is now their primary creative thrust.
By this time in college, I had really kind of started to focus, because of all the discouraging advice I had gotten from counselors about film, animation, etc. I did start to, take film classes, but mostly marketing and communication classes. And suddenly I get this call from Disney that they want me at WED, and I'm like, wow, for what? Well, we need draftsmen. We saw your portfolio and the work that you did in high school, and we need you. So I started at the tender age of 19, almost 20, as a draftsman. Those are a couple of examples of my high school drafting work that I had done that I guess caught their attention. And so I did some, you start off doing grunt work, as you should do, just kind of, doing title blocks and title pages and presentation, doing the old rub-on letters. And it wasn't long before I was asked to start working on the World of Motion, because there was a scene where you have the fast-talking salesman trying to sell the wheel, and they needed a Greek temple and a Chinese pagoda. So I drafted those up and submitted them, and it was incorporated into the show. And that might have caught Claude Coates' attention, who asked me to design a holiday scene, I guess, a section of the attraction that's like, oh, we need to fill this giant space in. Or I'm not sure what the story to this day was, but for some reason, this one scene had not been designed, and that was the hot air balloon scene. And so I came up with some sketches for what that might be, and basic idea was the balloon, which would be set in France, because that's where hot air balloons were designed, and it would be heading towards this sharp steeple, and there'd be like a goat on it, and this, I don't have the goat shots. This is like another person on saying, hey, watch out for the big steeple, and the other guy's kind of delirious. And Claude Coates said, yeah, it's a little fussy, it's a little hard to read, and he was absolutely right. And I did like another idea of the balloon, popped and landed in a tree, or the balloon flew away. None of those actually made it into the show, but what did make it were the buildings that I had drafted up. So in the final iteration of that show, these little buildings were off on the left to accentuate the idea that you're flying over France. So in the summer of 1979, at the 11th hour, Kodak comes on the scene, and they want a pavilion, and WED is short-staffed. There's really no one. Everyone's working, full-time on all the other shows. So Tony Baxter is pulled off of, before he's finished doing Big Thunder Mountain at Disneyland, he's pulled off of that to work on this, and he forms a team, and the team originally consisted of Barry Braverman, Skip Lang, Steve Kirk, Rick Harper, I believe, for a few months, Bob Rogers for a few months, and a few other folks. And we've got to figure out what this thing is going to be. And there's no architect at all. They're trying to get an architect, but there's no architect available. So I'm the de facto architect, because I know how to use a scale and draw a building. So I lay out this pavilion. There was a fourth element to it, which was this park. So, the park did kind of end up in there with the leapfrog fountains, but it was at one time going to be a much bigger park. And I come up with like a jillion different versions of the ride layout. I had never done a ride layout before. I was familiar with the ride layouts at Disneyland, so I kind of had that in the back of my head, and I knew what safety envelopes were and all of that, because I was a ride operator at Disneyland. So I came up with this. This was one of the plans. I think this is what we did show to Kodak. So what you see on the left and the right was presented to Kodak initially in the summer or at the end of summer, 1979, and they liked it. But then we have, a budget, thing to go through, estimating, and so we have to pare it down. But originally, the pavilion was going to be 2 floors. Well, it is 2 floors now, but the ride was going to go up to the upper level. There was going to be a second rotating turntable that let you off at the ImageWorks level, so you went directly into the ImageWorks. And this pavilion, this version of it, was over the budget, so we had to cut most of the park out and the second level dispatch for the ride. I drew up some crazy ideas for it because I was part of the story team early on, and I always wanted to do like a rendering in the style of one of the Imagineers. So I had done a rendering in the style of Claude Coates. I had done a rendering in the style of Clem Hall and a couple others. I hadn't done anything in the style of Mark Davis, so I tried this out with little Figment, playing in the sand, building a sand castle and dreaming of a castle in the background. And it sort of made it into the show, not the Figment part of it, but the castle part of it, which I ended up drafting up as a show set. Foreshadowing. But I did do all the set, eventually all the set drawings for Scene 3 and Scene 4. That's the turntable and dream catching machine and the Dreamport. And Steve Kirk came up with that fantastic model. That's me a long time ago. Steve Kirk built that model. Steve Kirk is also the one who designed Figment. Tony Baxter and Steve came up with the idea for Figment and Dreamfinder, and Steve designed the little dragon and that dream catching machine. And I took that dream catching machine and I wanted to make it even better than it was, refine it. And Steve said, go for it, make it even better. So I added tiny wings to it and worked on every little button in every phase of it. But the thing was that whole turntable was a clock, basically. It was a complicated mechanical scene that had moving parts and stationary parts, and I had to figure all of that out, and that's a plan of it. And we did another version of this that had tick marks on it. Each tick represented a second. So it literally was like a clock, or like in animation, like an exposure sheet, so that we could write out the dialogue and know, when there was too much dialogue in the script. This was about a 3.5 minute rotation around that circle. And we had, dividing walls that had to collapse and uncollapse and collapse, or, be able to break away in a worst case scenario, but also be able to absorb and dampen the sound from the adjacent theater. So we had to build 5 of these. I also ended up designing the vehicles, because the vehicles were designed in that teardrop shape for a very specific reason, to optimize the sight lines as well as get as many people as possible into a short amount of track space, because eventually those cars bunch up in the loading area, and there's a minimum and maximum speed that they could go. So this is all like, suddenly I'm also now kind of a industrial engineer or mechanical engineer trying to figure out to be able to deliver the THRC, and so you have to know all of that stuff that you have to know, divide by 3600 and all of that, 3600 seconds in every hour, and so that, from that you derive the THRC and the dispatch interval, and all of that is so closely interrelated. And so that's how we ended up with 7 passenger vehicles. It sounds dumb, like, well, why didn't you make them 6? Well, 7 is more than 6, so, well, then why didn't you make them 8? Well, if they were 8, they'd have to be spaced further apart. They wouldn't be able, they had to rotate 90 degrees. You'd have to space them further apart. Then you'd have to slow them down even slower in the station, and you'd reduce your capacity. So this was kind of the optimal configuration to make all that work. And so you had clouds, you had dream catching machines, you had fog puffers, special effects in the background. On the bottom is a section kind of that shows what moved and what didn't. It's probably hard to see in this presentation. But you had a static building, you had a rotating turntable with a dream catching machine and all sorts of apparatus on it. You had apparatus off-board as well, special effects projectors. We had to design a lot of clouds for that scene and other scenes, and so I became the cloud guy. I think, and I don't know how Walt Paragoy was responsible for one of the scenes in the show, the art scene, as Jim mentioned. But one day, I think he came to me, I started drawing clouds, and he said, "Well, those aren't clouds." That's Walt, right? "Those aren't clouds." I go, "They were not clouds. Why not?" He goes, no. Clouds are flat on the bottom, and then they're puffy on the top. I go, "Okay, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I never thought about that. You're right." He goes, "Put some style into it. Put yourself into it. Just draw some line." And I started looking at his artwork. I'm like, okay, I see what he means. And so I drew these and many other clouds. And to this day, I always draw clouds in this Walt Paragoy style. He taught me how to draw clouds, which I really appreciate and the attraction really needed. Here's how it kind of went together in one of the scenes. So we're rotating, but what's rotating seems like it's static, and what's static seems like it's rotating. So those clouds in the foreground are actually, nailed into the floor, and we're passing by them. And everything is there for a reason. Every edge of the cloud is hiding something, the edge of a screen or the fog puffer or there was a tank on board. That was the LN2, I guess, for the fog puffer. So it was very complicated, and I probably spent a total of a year working on this scene and the following scene, which was the Dreamport. So these two pictures that you're going to see here are actually publicity shots that they took. Everything else are going to be photos that I took during construction and a little bit afterwards. So I arrived on the scene in March or April of '82 to work with George Head and the Pico Group, and focused on this show, but also working on any other show that needed help at the moment. And so about once a week, I guess I would go out and I would take shots of both this pavilion and wherever I could walk around on the site for Epcot. And I'm glad I did that. I kind of wondered why at the time I was doing it, but, because I figured they must have photographers all over the place taking pictures of this, but I'd like some of my own. So I probably have 1,000 photos, and you're going to just see a tiny, tiny percentage of that. I've posted some of them previously, and then there's some here that haven't been seen before. Walt Paragoy also worked on the elevator. I took a shot at designing that elevator, but they preferred Walt Paragoy's design over what I did, and I can probably see why. So here's the park, and if anyone remembers that acrylic structure that was out there for the first 2 or 3 years, and I think Kodak had directed us towards that, because Kodak was indirectly involved with the making of the plastic. Somehow Kodak was tied at the time with Lexan, the Lexan company, and I can't remember why that was. They said, go out to Irvine, there's a little play structure out there that we were involved with, and it's kind of neat, and it looks like little bubbles, and it kind of looks like the crystals of the pavilion. So we went out there, and yeah, it was pretty cool. It had been there for a year. It was in good shape. The thing you always have to worry about is yellowing, the stuff getting calcified and yellow. So that didn't happen. It got mildewy. It got mold and mildew after only 2 or 3 years in the Florida humidity, and it had to be taken out eventually. But these are all shots that are taken, I think, within, not the upper left. The other two, though, are in September. The one on the upper left is probably August. So it's all very last minute. I went back and looked at these shots. I hadn't seen them for 35 years, and only recently, in the last couple of years, took them out and started scanning them. And it's like, oh, that's Fred Jurger down there. he's a Disney legend and started in the model shop back in the 50s. These are some shots. Sometimes there's Polaroids in here, even though it was a Kodak pavilion. But that was the only way to get pictures right away. Sometimes we needed a picture immediately because we would draw on the picture. Sometimes, issue that as part of a change order or change directive if there was some conflict or issue. I think that's me on the lower right, trying to look busy or trying to look like I'm doing something. I don't know if you remember those. Those are the Kaleidoscopes. They might still be there. I'm not certain if they took them out or if they're still hiding behind the wall there. I know they took out the rainbow corridor. But finally, the pavilion opened. This is the night before, September 30th. I went around and took a bunch of night shots of the park. Not now, the one on the upper right, I believe, is a publicity photo from the company. But the two on the left are shots that I took. And there's, I didn't know how many to put in this presentation because I could go on and on and on. The leapfrogs were an immediate hit. I'm looking at these photos going, oh, there's Tony and Mark Fuller, the inventor of the leapfrog fountains. And someone said, well, that's interesting. I think I posted that picture, right, a couple weeks ago. And then someone said, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that Tony Baxter had 4 arms. I'm like, what? Oh, what? And so I had to go back through my photos and find out, what? There must be someone standing behind him. And sure enough, as one of the other guys, wearing the same shirt almost, that's Pete Stugard, who was responsible for Dreamfinder's School of Drama. I think he was the producer for those films, if I'm not mistaken. So people ask, well, what was, because the ride didn't open. Everything else opened on opening day except for the ride. So what was in there? What was going on? It's like the Haunted Mansion, right? And what did it look like in the lobby? Well, this is what it looked like in the lobby. So this was taken in November. That's my mom. My folks came out. And there was a sign up there saying that coming soon will be this really fantastic ride. And the mural was all finished, beautiful mural by Toshi Muto. And so it was quite the, quite a lot of activity going on behind the wall. And then if you were to venture deeper into the attraction, this is what it looked like. There were vehicles in there, but they weren't cycling yet. They had built a bypass between the flight to Dreamfinder and the Dreamport. So it bypassed the rotating turntable so that they could cycle the attraction without relying on the turntable, because the turntable was its own kind of animal. There's the Walt Paraguay clouds on the right and the drawing on top there, and the turntable. So these are rare shots of the turntable being built. And it was really, sometimes even for me, because I was intimately familiar with it, but I'd always have to kind of remind myself what was stationary and what was moving. The big kind of screen-looking thing in that center shot there is a window, and it had to be a window to isolate the sound. And behind that were dozens and dozens and rows of effects projectors that have projected clouds, stars, rainbows, things that were in the script onto a rear screen that would later be installed in there. So the center there does not rotate. Everything else in the foreground rotates. And I think some shots here of the Dream Machine being installed. The backside of Dream Machine, like the backside of water, right? You never see that. And now the Dreamport, so this was the other scene that I was heavily involved in, and I was in the world's largest hologram before they installed the hologram there. And this is where the spark jars were, and and the Polage, if you remember that, on the upper right, hadn't been turned on yet. So this is what it looked like. All these shots are how it sat, waiting to be finished between October and March of '83. Figment's Pond. literature, my first castle, the showbiz or performing arts, and what about science? And the next scene, hello, which has the fewest amount of photos, was the kind of film sequence with the figment puppets in the circle vision kind of setup. And now venturing outside of Journey into Imagination, a few shots of construction. So what's remarkable about these is these are all like August and September. And we get closer to opening, of course, it looks a little bit more finished. But even these, on the left, there's still, area development, flat works are kind of like the last thing, the ground that you walk on, the concrete is about the last thing that you do, and you see them pouring sometimes, up to a few nights before opening. Again, I think this is August. China was very late. That was definitely August. Some extraordinary shots of just stillness in the morning, no people, ready to open. This might be September 30th. And so that, I thought I'd share some photos because people like those photos. A little bit about what I'm heading into now, which is archaeology of Disneyland, of Walt Disney World, and of Walt Disney Imagineering. And I started to do, this started a few years ago as an idea for Disney Editions. It remains to be seen whether it will go ahead with Disney Editions, because what happened is as I started researching for the archaeology of Disneyland and Disney World, I started to find names I had never heard of before. Like, who designed the castle, actually? Herbie Ryman did a painting of the one here, but who actually designed it? And Bill Martin is the architect on record, but he didn't design it. So I talked to some people who were, including Glenn Derflinger, who were draftsmen on that project, and they said it was a guy named Ted Rich. And I said, who's Ted Rich? And so there's been about 50 of these Ted Riches who I've never heard of, and that led to the idea of doing a book about the early history of Imagineering to capture the stories and the biographies of Imagineers that you've never heard of before. You're not going to see any of that today because that is a real book that's going to come out, hopefully, in a year or so. So I'm not showing any of those shots, but I'm showing some kind of public domain material that shows the kind of thing that I'm looking at for Disneyland and Disney World. This is the property for that we're on right now. Actually, this is, I think, the next square. This is the Buena Vista parcel here. So this is about 1/4 of the entire property going back to 18-something. This is like the first recorded map of the area. That's how far back I'm going. Disneyland, by the way, there were some photos that were taken on the Disneyland site in 1903 that you can actually pinpoint on a map exactly. You can geo-reference them. And that will be, if I do the book on Disneyland, that will be in that one. So I like to go back as far as possible. A guy at Pixar who I think used to live out here maybe and is interested in Walt Disney World found these on the U.S. Geological site. And there's some that are even older than this, but it's all very piecemeal. So it's hard to get an entire set of tiles, that make up the whole property. But there were 3 taken in 1954 that give you an indication of what this property, what this area looked like way back when, before there was even, hardly a notion even of Disneyland. And you can spot some interesting things like, I just wanted to put that, that's not to scale, but you can see kind of where they got the idea. It was Paul Hartley who got the idea. The graphic kind of style is so representative of the bogs and lakes, and just you can see those patterns all throughout the property. Because I always wondered about how did they kind of randomly come up with that pattern language, and it is from the geology of the site. Here's an interesting thing. Well, here's an interesting thing. So that big, green belt that's in the middle of the parking lot, I don't know what the story, maybe someone here knows the story of why they left it that way, but it's something that you can see, and there's Magic Kingdom up there. And when you pull that away, the little bog is still down there. So there's something special about that. I don't know if it's the world's largest sinkhole, or there was a species of some sort that was in there that they couldn't touch. I know that was kind of a later thing. It happened at Epcot. I'm not aware of anything from opening day. So that just gives you a little insight into the kind of work I'm doing with this archaeology, even the property plan from 65. Those are all the parcels. Again, this isn't the entire property. This is about a quarter of it. And every tiny little, some of those were given away in promotional contests and things like that. So they had to track down, who was the property owner of those individual little lots. The big ones, of course, were easy. So eventually I'm going to get a hold of the Buzz Price. I believe there's a document that shows all of the potential sites for Walt Disney World. There's like 7 or other sites in this general area that they were looking at, including one that was even bigger than what they ended up with. So these are just some little shots of that same square. It's called Township 24, just for the record. I think we are in Township 23 here, and this is Township 24 in 65. So by this time, Disney's acquired the property, and does this thing have a laser? Yeah, there we go. Somewhere down there is the Bronson Residence, which was the place where Walt and Joe Fowler and all those folks, when they would come out here to tour the property, which was at least twice, maybe only twice for Walt. There was actually an airstrip here, right here. That's it. And just south of that was the one of 2 homes, I think, on the property. The other was on the Treasure Island in Bay Lake. And then there was this one down here. And that's where they would go. They'd fly in from California. They would fly into McCoy, I guess, and take a Jeep down. And then Erlo Bronson's brother, who owned the cottage, would treat them to lunch, and they would go out in the Jeep. Where they went is not known exactly, but those pictures that you see of Walt walking around with Fowler is right around his home, or around the Bronson home. So at some point, I'm going to get those all exactly geo-referenced and pinpointed. 1969, you can begin to see the property develop, and the Bronson home is still down there. This is Black Lake. The preview center would eventually go right there. And these photos are all, you find them online under different organizations. So the worst one is the United States Geological Survey, only because they have all this stuff, but it's so difficult to navigate through. But other universities, you go online, and California is great because UC Santa Barbara has a fantastic website where all of Southern California, you can pinpoint various locations in various years, and so a lot of these plot plans for Disneyland are available. This is an interesting thing that I found recently on an old drawing that was in a non-Disney archive. And this was, kind of the holy grail for Disney World archaeology is to find iterative plans of the Magic Kingdom, which are, I've seen like 2 or 3, and they're all like 1970, mid-1970, 1971. They're not much different than how it opened, but this one is drastically different. So it must be from 1967 or 1968. Let's see if we can bring some things up here. Okay, you can see the monorail is running through the Magic Kingdom, through Tomorrowland, and they have indicated a monorail station in the middle of Tomorrowland. And here's Tomorrowland with that looks like Space Mountain down there. And here's Big Thunder Mountain up here. So those are two kind of obvious things. The more I look at this, I mean, I just discovered this only a few days ago, so the more I look at it, the more interesting things I find. And there'll be another one, I think, coming up. Yeah. This is a Pinocchio Street. I've seen reference to a Pinocchio Street, but I didn't know what. I kind of assumed it was what they ended up with by Small World, but there's another little street here that was carved into the east complex over here that was at one time considered, and which probably would have been a good idea. Probably would have been better to keep that wide up there, and then here you had a wide artery, and then putting a small artery in like that would make sense if you have the larger artery. But what they ended up with, and I understand from reading memos, is that there was some instability in the soil up here, which is why they had to move Small World south and kind of create that pinch point between Peter Pan and It's a Small World. And notice also that Haunted Mansion and Small World are not quite in their final positions here, nor is 20,000 Leagues. You've got the kind of a Disneyland style Autopia up here, and I love this lake that's in the middle of Tomorrowland, this kind of winding waterway with islands, and it is really kind of a cool feature. And the last thing I noticed was the Tiki Room is down here by the kind of snugged into the Jungle Cruise, between the treehouse and the Jungle Cruise. So they must have imagined kind of a lush jungle environment to put the Tiki Room and the Tahitian Terrace and the Tahitian Terrace show, bunch them together and put them down in this very tropical, lush area between the treehouse and the Jungle Cruise. All sorts of other things kind of show up on this. It's like, well, where do you find something like this? It's a mistake. It is on an older drawing, and it's what you call a key plan. So on the title page of every set of drawings, they put a key plan. It's cut into the drawing. And it's just to show you where the particular area that the drawing package is addressing. In this case, it's the Carousel of Progress. So this is a 1973 package, and it's not the whole package. It was just the title page. It was in an archive at one of the local universities in Southern California. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, that's not from 1973. This is a much, much older key plan. Well, the reason for that is that key plans were separately printed. They were put in a drawer in a drafting room with a draftsman, either for the architects, the architectural department, engineering department, show set department, where I was. And you'd open up a drawer to get a key plan, so you'd splice it into the drawing. Sometimes the latest key plan, you'd run out of it, and there'd be older key plans in there, so you just splice the older key plan into it, because it really didn't matter if the key plan was up to date. It was just to show you kind of where on the clock it was. So I noticed in going through some other packages that there's a lot of these older key plans that show up on those packages. So now I'm trying to keep an eye whenever I come across one of these packages to look at this front page, which I always ignore. I mean, there's no reason, to ever look at this. So now look at these key plans. So keep your eyes out. Those are that, sometimes can find these construction packages that the key plans may indicate iterative versions of the Magic Kingdom. And I think maybe for once in my life I finished a presentation. Maybe I went through too quickly, because usually I go way over time. Because I guess we could have dwelled on the photos a little bit more. But I think that's my presentation. Oh, no, there's one more. I forgot. This always bugged me. Pirates of the Caribbean. Okay, the first thing you learn in any kind of like architectural or building or design, anything having to do with, building a building, is to reduce the number of corners on the building. It's not cost effective. It's not cost effective to randomly put an angle into a building. So for example, if you were to put an angle between that corner and that corner, that would cost more than doing what they did. But if you have multiple corners, like here, you would just draw a line and save $100,000 or so. Same here. So I don't know what the thinking was. For years, I've always wondered if there's no one, I never got a chance to talk to Don Edgren because I really wasn't interested in all of this, when I had the opportunity to talk to all these people. But another recent find was they were considering something that was a little more economical. I mean, to me, that's a more economical plan. There's fewer corners. It's basically the same attraction, cited a little bit differently. But this obviously precedes. So for some reason, this didn't work. I don't know if it was, again, a geology issue. I know they wanted to get more merchandise up front, and that makes total sense. I get that. But why all the corners is a mystery, because it's clearly more expensive. And I can't figure that one out. But this is kind of a cool piece because I've always wondered if there were other versions of Pirates of the Caribbean. There is actually it's not going to be in this show because it's something I found at Disney, and it looks like it might have been done by Claude Coates. Cool. That precedes this. So that, I believe, finally finishes up the show. If it says that's all, folks, why does it keep going? Why? Why? It doesn't want it to end. It's not going to end. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Jeez.
All right.
Did I go too long?
You're right. Ladies and gentlemen, right. Mr. Tom Morris.